My name is Dana Mulligan, and I am a junior majoring in crop and soil science from Virginia Tech. Today, I'll be talking to you about the power of vulnerability. It took me 2 weeks of staring at a blank Word document to write this talk. In some ways, vulnerability is something I'm comfortable with. It's a concept I've held in my mind and tried to live my life by since I was 15 years old. It's what I wrote my Common App essay about. In fact, I've been told that it was that essay that earned me a spot as a stamp scholar. Let me read you the essay of the event that catalyzed my understanding of vulnerability. I hope it will give you some context as to what vulnerability is, at least what my understanding of it is. For years, a major factor in how I behaved and interacted with the world was mental illness. Starting at around 9 years old, I began to suffer from anxiety and insomnia. This led to many canceled sleepovers, nights where it took hours to fall asleep, and missed opportunities because I was too afraid that my anxiety would cause me to fail. But despite all the pain it caused me, my anxiety has made me so much stronger than I would be without it. Not only did it teach me courage, doing something even though you're scared, but it also taught me how to not feel ashamed for who I am or what my circumstances happen to be. During all my years of suffering from anxiety, not a single one of my friends knew about my therapist visits or nightly breakdowns. But 2 nights before leaving for Uganda on a State Department trip during a pre-departure orientation, I was encouraged to sit down and tell my story to the people who would be accompanying me to Kampala. So I finally did. It was ugly, and there was lots of tears and snot, but I had never anticipated how good I would feel afterwards. It was a catharsis of sorts. After that night, I was a different person. The shell of anxiety that had kept me cramped and silent was gone, and I was free to be myself and say what I thought to whomever I liked. My anxiety was still there, but it no longer controlled me because it no longer held the power of shame or fear of judgment. If I felt homesick or helpless, I would tell someone about it and they would talk to me until my anxiety passed. The very act of spending a month in a foreign country away from everyone I knew, something that had previously been one of my greatest fears, proved to me how strong I was. Before my trip, I had told myself repeatedly, if I can do this, I can do anything. Anxiety taught me that I am capable of facing my greatest fears under no one's command but my own and surviving. And from that, I've learned to take every opportunity I get without hesitation. Even if I am afraid, I know I am capable of whatever I choose to do. So, by definition, vulnerability is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. In my case, I was vulnerable when I put myself into a situation that terrified me and was open about how scared I was. The people I chose to open up to could have laughed me off, told me I was ridiculous for feeling the way that I did. But instead, my choice to be vulnerable with them, as well as their choice to be vulnerable with me, opened up the door for connection and growth. Ultimately, that vulnerability led to an incredibly transformative experience. So at that time, when I wrote that essay as a high school senior, it took a lot of vulnerability in order for me to recount that story about being vulnerable. So when I first set out to write this talk, I thought that was the story I would focus on. But as I sat staring at a blank page day after day, wondering why the story wasn't coming to me, I realized why I couldn't tell that story anymore. That was nearly 6 years ago. While I consider it a highly transformative part of my life, it's no longer a difficult story for me to tell anymore. Telling that story doesn't make me feel vulnerable or afraid, or like I'm standing up here in my underwear with nowhere to hide. I realize that if I try to give a talk on vulnerability, but don't make myself vulnerable in the process, then it's an inauthentic talk. Who am I to stand up here telling a story that makes me feel safe and secure and using it to tell you to be vulnerable? So I've decided to lead by example. I'm going to tell you a story that I'm still wrestling with. Writing it is scary, and saying it out loud is even scarier. But I believe in the power of being vulnerable, so here we go. After having such an incredible experience during my summer in Uganda, I decided to do a gap year in Senegal after I graduated from high school. I figured that if I had grown so much as a person during a single month in Uganda, then 10 months in Senegal would result in 10 times as much personal growth. I would like to note that when I finally sat down to write this talk, as soon as I hit this spot, I immediately veered off to Facebook in order to avoid writing about it. While I was in Uganda, I bonded closely with my host family, made incredible friends, and blossomed as a human being. In Senegal, everything was the complete opposite. I don't know if it was the language barrier, the lack of structure, that the program was poorly suited for me, that my antimalarials were making me sick, or if it was just me, but I failed to thrive in Senegal. My host family was kind and caring, but I spent hours shut away in my room. I struggled to make friends at school. The sights and sounds of the city which enthralled me at the beginning of my time there instead overwhelmed me, bringing me to tears at times. Actually, more often than I care to say. My French remained rudimentary, and my Wolof was even more dismal. After 7 months of fighting to keep my head above the water, I decided to cut my time short and go home. Making the choice to leave early was one of the hardest decisions of my life. In short, I failed, and not in a "at least you tried your best" kind of way. I was not even close to my best self. I was irritable, unmotivated, and shut down. It's been 3 years since I came home, and I'm still working through the shame and guilt of feeling that I didn't rise to the occasion when given such an incredible opportunity. The reason I'm telling you all this is not because I love telling strangers my deep, dark secrets. I'm telling you the story in hopes that you see the power of vulnerability. I hope that at least some of you resonated with my story, or at least you feel like you understand me a little bit better now that you've heard it. It's really, really hard to be vulnerable. It feels really weird. Not to mention, it's absolutely terrifying. I find that so many people shy away from being vulnerable in fear that telling these stories that dig so close to our core will push others away. What's worse than revealing your inner self and being rejected? What's more painful than taking the risk to do something that terrifies you and then failing? But it wouldn't be vulnerability if there wasn't that risk. The power behind vulnerability is believing you're worthy as you are, whether you fail or succeed, or are rejected or accepted. Vulnerability is about having the courage to be authentic. It's not about the outcome. I made myself vulnerable in my decision to jump straight from my high school graduation in Falls Church, Virginia, into a year in Dakar, Senegal. It was terrifying, and the possibility of failure was very real. And it happened. I failed. It was so painful to take a risk and put myself out there like that, just in order to crash and burn in such an extraordinary fashion. But I'm so glad I had the courage to show up and be engaged, even if I failed. I'm even grateful for my failure. Vulnerability is uncertainty. It's doing something that makes you uncomfortable or opens you up to judgment, rejection, even failure. Vulnerability is never going to be a comfortable thing. So why is something so uncomfortable something you should strive to have more of in your life? Vulnerability is at the core of meaningful human experiences. In the words of famous vulnerability researcher Brené Brown, vulnerability is antidote to fear, shame, and disengagement. Vulnerability is not always going to be dark and painful, but it's not always going to be light and easy. In short, to feel any emotion is to be vulnerable. Brené Brown defines it as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Vulnerability is often confused with weakness. To dispel this myth, let's take a step back. Some examples of vulnerability include standing up for myself, saying I love you first without knowing if they'll say it back, calling a friend who just lost a loved one, asking for help, sharing a work of writing or art that I've created, trying something I've never done before, admitting that I'm afraid, being accountable, admitting a mistake, and asking for forgiveness. Do any of those things sound like weakness? Absolutely not. Vulnerability is showing up to the table again and again with courage and humility. I'm certain that none of you in this room got to where you are now without at least a little vulnerability, and in most cases, I bet it took quite a lot. I know everyone in this room has achieved amazing things, and I'm certain that it took a lot of risk, uncertainty, and vulnerability. For those of you who have studied abroad, it takes immense amounts of courage to immerse yourself in a new culture and language. You open yourself up to misunderstanding, to mistakes, to embarrassment. And because you're willing to make yourself vulnerable in that way, you make new friends, grow as a human being, and maybe even call a new country home. For those of you who have done internships with high-level professionals and organizations in your field, that takes courage. Just the act of applying opens you up to the possibility of failure. And what's scarier than the first day at a new job where you're just an undergraduate and everyone around you is the best in their field? It takes a lot of vulnerability to be the new kid, to figure things out and make yourself useful when everyone else has been working there for years. But because you showed up day after day, even though it was hard and uncomfortable, you learned so much and had an amazing experience. For those of you in the audience who are artists, musicians, dancers, writers, what's more horrifying than sharing something you've created with someone else? I can speak from personal experience that it feels like handing someone part of your soul and hoping they don't tell you it's ugly and that you should be embarrassed for having created it. I had a dear friend of mine who refused to be vulnerable, and I watched it destroy her. She shared with me that she was suffering from untreated mental illness. When I urged her to get help, she refused, citing that talking to a therapist, a friend, or a relative would just make her feel stupid and make things worse. While there's a much, much bigger conversation to be had around the stigmas and stereotypes that surround mental illness in this country, I would not be surprised if much of that stemmed from a society that associates vulnerability with weakness. To speak about one's struggle with mental illness is to be vulnerable, and unfortunately, too many people think that to be vulnerable is to be weak, and thus they never feel comfortable to seek support or help for their struggle. Ironically, the illusion of invulnerability, the idea that avoiding being vulnerable completely can make us impenetrable, actually makes us more susceptible to harm. While my friend thought she was making herself stronger by refusing help, I had to stand and watch as her mental illness worsened without sufficient treatment or support. While it may seem counterintuitive, having the ability to be vulnerable makes us stronger. Vulnerability is a bit of a paradox in American society. To show you what I mean, I'd like to ask all of you 2 questions. First, how many of you struggle to be vulnerable because you think of vulnerability as a weakness? Second, when you watch the people up here on this stage being vulnerable, how many of you thought it was courageous? We love to see raw truth and openness in others, but we're afraid for them to see it in us. We're afraid that our truth isn't enough, that everyone else's vulnerability is meaningful and brave, while ours is too messy, too inadequate. But in order to be vulnerable, you must be willing to show up, to see, and to be seen. It's about asking yourself what's worth doing, even if you fail. Because as human beings, we're constantly vulnerable whether we like it or not, as life is uncertain, messy, and unpredictable no matter how much we try to control it. We have no choice in experiencing vulnerability, but we do have a choice in how we respond to uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So, if this talk has you wanting to open yourself a little more to some vulnerability in your life, how can you go about doing that? Luckily, it doesn't have to be running around telling everyone you know your darkest secrets. However, it does require a lot of practice. For me, my vulnerability journey started with putting myself into uncomfortable or scary situations. A summer in Uganda, a gap year in Senegal, joining the rugby team when I got to college, which, by the way, as a former dancer with no sports experience, I was absolutely terrible at rugby and only played for a semester. But I had a ton of fun doing it and worked on whittling away my perfectionism by doing something every single day for a whole semester that I was awful at. Putting myself into uncomfortable situations, especially when I know it's something I'm not particularly good at, is still hard for me. But it's something I try to do as often as possible, like speaking up in French class when I know my pronunciation is atrocious. Vulnerability is embracing the challenge and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Being vulnerable becomes much easier to tap into when at the end of the day, you know you're enough. When you love yourself and believe that you're enough as you are, you put a little less weight into others will accept you or not. Most importantly, we do need others. We can't go at this alone. One of the best things that happened to my vulnerability journey was when one of my close friends at college asked if I wanted to start a meditation and mindfulness club at Virginia Tech with her. I jumped at the opportunity and we decided to call it Conscious Collective. While it's officially a meditation club, we call it more of a vulnerability and human experience club. Since its founding a year and a half ago, it's grown into a wonderful and welcoming community that I am proud to call home. I think what makes it such a special community is that everyone in it is willing to be vulnerable, whether that means sharing a personal story or saying you'd rather not contribute when everyone else is sharing a personal story. It's that mutual vulnerability and authenticity that allows most newcomers to instantly feel that they can be themselves here. It's a place where vulnerability is encouraged and welcomed but never forced. For me, it's the first place I've ever felt I truly belonged, where I'm loved for my vulnerabilities rather than in spite of them. For some of you, that support may come from your family, your friends, perhaps people you haven't even met yet. And maybe your first and greatest step towards vulnerability will be asking for support. Thank you.